Hello and welcome to this SSE Alumni Webinar on the topic Co-Create the Future of Clean Energy, arranged in collaboration with the House of Innovation and the German SSE Alumni Hub, where we will learn about what fosters and challenges the creation of impactful clean energy innovation. My name is Anna Månsson and I work at the Alumni Office here at the Stockholm School of Economics. And I would first off like to mention some housekeeping rules. So due to the number of participants, we have muted you, but feel free to submit any questions you have in the chat directly to me, Anna Månsson. There will be time for a brief Q&A after all the speakers have presented. And also we are recording this webinar, so it will be made available afterwards. But please note that it's only the speakers who are recorded, so you in the audience will not be on camera. But we have a full program tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to both SSE faculty and our industry experts from the SSE alumni community discuss this very interesting and highly relevant topic. So, to kick off this webinar, I would first like to give the word to our moderator for the evening, Margot Enthoven, postdoctoral researcher at the House of Innovation at SSE. Over to you, Margot.
Thank you for that introduction, Anna, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this webinar, which is co-arranged by SSE Alumni, House of Innovation, and the SSE Alumni Hub in Germany. As Anna said, my name is Margot Enthoven, and I'm a researcher working on public-private innovation and the circular economy. Now, for the next hour, we'll be hearing from a group of experts and industry actors on the topic of clean energy and the transformation towards a low-carbon economy. And we are going to do that under the title Co-Create the Future of Clean Energy. And the goal of today is to explore the challenges and opportunities for innovation in clean energy, the complex interactions between the different actors in the ecosystem for clean energy. And this includes corporations, entrepreneurs, the government, and researchers. So as you see, there's a lot to discuss today. And we are joined by 4 panelists, and I will take a few moments to ask them to introduce themselves today and also to thank them for their time. So we have 3 SSE alumni joining us today, and I'm just going to start with the order as you appear on my screen. And I first like to introduce Klaas Afberen. Klaas, can you take a few words to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Klaas Afberen, and I went to SSE in 2008. I've been in the energy business for the last 10 years, and I'm department manager of WSP, which is a technical consultancy firm, basically.
Thank you, Klaas. And we're also joined by Wilhelm Löwenhjelm. Willem, would you like to take a few words as well to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. Yes, thank you. My name is Wilhelm Löwenhjelm. I am the director of the energy storage system business area at Northvolt, which is a Sweden-based battery manufacturer. Prior to joining Northvolt, I was an entrepreneur in the solar industry for 10 years at a company called Alight that I co-founded, and I'm now the chairman of the board of that company. So also been in the energy industry, similar to Klaas, pretty much since graduating from the Stockholm School of Economics back in 2006.
Thank you, Wilhelm. And our third guest for today is Susanna Campbell, who I'll also ask to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I graduated from Stockholm School of Economics in '96, I think it was. I have a long background in the finance industry, doing private equity and so on. But these days, for the last, I guess, 5-6 years, I've spent most of my time focusing on companies really moving the needle on sustainability and the climate question. So Been working a lot with a foundation in Stockholm called Norrsken, building impact companies, and also on the board of Northvolt, where Willem works, and H2 Green Steel. So big companies trying to really transform traditional industries. So investor and board professional today.
Thank you, Susanna. And besides these 3 SSE alumni, we're also joined by one of our own staff, Homer Kok. And before I ask you to introduce yourself, I want to share with you that Homer will take 10 minutes to kind of set the stage and share some research insights with us all today before we go into a panel discussion. So welcome, Homer, and please go ahead and introduce yourself and take it over from here.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Margot, for this excellent introduction, and thank you all for joining this event today. I'm just going to start sharing my slides, and while I do so, I will also introduce myself. So my name is Homer Kok. I'm an assistant professor at the House of Innovation at SSE, which is a newly formed research house at SSE. We've been around for now about 3 years. We focus a lot on topics at the intersection of innovation, digitalization, entrepreneurship, and engage in all kinds of research and teaching and outreach activities on those. So if you want to know more about this and the other activities we do, I'll also provide a link at the end. So a lot of my research focuses on the empirical context of renewable energy. And as a result, I've also learned a lot about this particular context, and also have generated some, let's say, generalizable insights that I think can be very useful to share and also to set the stage for today. So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about what I see is important to know about co-creation and the future of clean energy. And I will try to keep it at a rather high level, and also to make sure that we can still open up for discussion afterwards. So I want to start with this quote, which I really like, from Bill Gates. This is from 2016, and this is a quote where he reflects on the fact that if we want to solve these urgent problems that we are facing, such as how to reach zero emissions by the end of the century, we need a lot of unconventional and even crazy ideas. Now, this is not just crazy ideas in terms of research. It's not just about creating technologies that are very different from what we know. It's also about having new ideas about how to collaborate with each other. So I think that the understanding of what these ideas are is quite broad. And I think that, as we'll discuss today, our understanding of how to co-create the future of clean energy and how to collaborate will hopefully change. And you will also come to understand that this is broader than you might currently think. So before we start talking about co-creation and the need for collaboration, I think it's actually good to start asking the question, why do we even need to collaborate? Because it might sound intuitive, but I don't think it really is. And I think by asking this question, we can also start discussing which exact aspects of collaboration we actually need to stimulate more. So my view is that there is what I would call a more knowledge or technological part of things, where 2 trends are increasing the need for collaboration. The first one is that organizations are becoming more specialized instead of more generalized, meaning they're narrowing down their technological expertise in fewer domains, because science and technology are becoming more complicated. So organizations are forced to do so. But at the same time, there's also a greater need to incorporate a lot of interdisciplinary knowledge into new products. So a lot of organizations need to really reach outside their traditional boundaries to develop technologies that will help improve their products, and that eventually it will help consumers more. So on the one hand, you have organizations becoming more specialized, but on the other hand, you also have organizations needing more interdisciplinary knowledge. And together, that really has a strong interaction with each other that stimulates the need for collaboration. There's also a more organizational part, which has to do with incentives between different organizations that are not aligned with each other, that makes it difficult to create and support activities that will generate synergies with the activities of other organizations. And there's also a strong need for coordination among different organizations, which stimulates, again, the need for collaboration. And these are patterns that we see in a lot of industries, not just in renewable energy, but I argue that within renewable energy, these particular factors are especially important to understand. So I'm going to talk about the knowledge part first a little bit more. And I like to use this quote because it's a fairly credible quote. When you say I have a quote from Albert Einstein, people tend to pay attention and want to know a little bit more what you're talking about. Now, Albert Einstein was once asked, how do you come up with these very interesting ideas, these new theories about things? How do you explain the creative process? And he replied in a longer way than I propose here, but one part is about what he calls combinatory play, which is about having existing ideas in your head and forming new connections between them. So he said, most ideas that I come up with are actually not entirely novel. They're just a combination of things that I already knew, and I put them together in a different way. And in my research and in the field of innovation research, a lot of people use this perspective to also explain where new innovations come from. So they say a new innovation is a combination of existing technologies, or it's a combination of knowledge in a new way. And if you look at existing products like a wind turbine or even a laptop, if you take it apart, you start understanding that, yeah, these are pieces of knowledge of technology that have been around for a long time, and they were put together in a different way. That also means that if you want to develop these technologies better, you also need to go to the developer and the specialist in one of those components in order to be able to develop a better system as a whole. And this can explain also why we see certain kinds of collaborations happening in renewable energy. Now, to simplify it even further, and this is an analogy that I quite like, you can also think of it as Lego pieces. So the more Lego pieces you have, the easier it is for you to create something new and interesting. If you have a small stack of pieces, you cannot create something very interesting. If you have a very big stack of pieces, if you have access to a lot of different technologies and knowledge, you're able to create innovations that are more interesting. Now, to make this more concrete, let's look at how this looks like in one specific field. Now, I'm picking these examples because I've done personally a lot of research in hydrogen and fuel cells, because there have been a lot of collaborations in this field, making it easy for me as a researcher to also examine this. So one interesting, and I must emphasize, these are ongoing as well as prior collaborations, so not all of these exist anymore. So one interesting collaboration was between a firm called Viant and another firm called Webasto. Now, these are not two firms that you will usually see collaborating with each other because they're actually operating in very different industries. One develops boilers that can be used at home, while the other one develops all kinds of components for automotive vehicles. So that's Webasto. But they saw a need and a purpose to collaborate with each other and exchange knowledge about fuel cells in useful ways, because they were both working on it, but in slightly different domains. We also see collaborations with universities, which we say hold more basic knowledge about technologies. They understand the underlying processes, the theoretical mechanisms, and usually they try to combine this with the more applied knowledge of for-profit firms. So a lot of these collaborations are also very common. It's not just for-profit firms collaborating with each other, it's also universities and research institutes being involved. Collaborations with specialized fuel cell firms and automotive firms have also been very common. So one example is Ballard Power Systems, which is a very quite well-known fuel cell system developer that collaborates with a lot of automotive firms to help them to optimize how the fuel cell system would work within the automotive vehicle. So these kinds of collaborations are very important because you need to optimize a lot of these clean technologies that are integrated into a new product at the level of the whole system. So you don't need to just make a good battery. You need to make a battery that works really well within the system in which it's integrated. Similar patterns we can see, for example, with a collaboration between Boeing and a fuel cell system developer called Intelligent Energy, where they're trying to develop airplanes and derivatives of it running on fuel cells. And finally, we also have, I guess, a little bit more the expected, but also important collaboration between oil companies and automotive firms, where really the understanding of how this whole infrastructure would work, because the fuel cell vehicle can be amazing, but if the infrastructure for hydrogen does not work well, or the end customer doesn't use the car in the right way or doesn't understand how to refuel it, then you also have a problem. Now, a case in point that also links to the importance of aligning incentives came from the Green X initiative that Nike and Creative Commons and Best Buy launched a few years ago. Now, this was a web-based marketplace where a lot of companies could share all kinds of intellectual property about sustainable technologies. And the idea behind this is that there's a lot of redundancies and duplication of efforts. You have 10 companies working on solving the same problem in sustainability, but all of them are unaware of each other's activities. So you have essentially 10 times the same solution for one problem, when it could have just been one firm making this available to all others, which would of course lead to much more efficient use, which as a society we need. It's not in our benefit to have 10 of the same solutions being developed. It's a lot better if these resources are put to more productive use. On the final part of the presentation, I want to give a special focus on government actors, because these are often underemphasized in these discussions, but I think they play a quite unique role in driving the push towards clean energy. So governments have one function which we call technology push, where they are major funders of research and development in clean tech. And we see programs about this in different countries and regions, like in the US, we have the Department of Energy programs. In Europe, renewables are a key part of Horizon 2020, and so on. And these programs are very good. So they involve collaboration because they need to interact with different organizations, provide them funding and work with them. And they're very good because they overcome all kinds of managerial problems. So technology myopia is one. A lot of organizations find it very difficult to invest and understand how to stimulate the creation of technologies that are unconventional. And these types of programs help to actually stimulate the creation of such kinds of technologies. It also helps to resolve misaligned incentives, because for-profit firms often have low incentives to invest in certain technologies if they do not see that there will be a return for it. So if the commercial market is very small, a lot of firms will have low incentives to invest in those in technologies for those markets. So the government can step in to kind of subsidize these efforts instead and make sure that these technologies are being developed. Partner myopia is another thing. So organizations are often biased towards familiar organizations. So they want to work with organizations that they're familiar with and that their competitors have also worked with. And governments can actually overcome this by creating a forum for discussion and by enabling the identification of partners that an organization might normally not work with. Governments can also provide a clear framework for collaboration, because oftentimes organizations find it very difficult to work with each other. And then within the context of a government-funded program, they might find it easier to do so. Now, the government also has a demand pool function where they actually facilitate the creation of markets for technologies. And they can do this through technology procurement, for example, where they become customers for new technologies that have certain predefined characteristics. They can set roadmaps that are actually very good in aligning expectations and guiding all the activities of different organizations towards one goal. They can, of course, provide subsidies through tariffs. So in wind energy, for example, feed-in tariffs have been very important in terms of stimulating the creation of markets, almost too much. And maybe this is something we can bring up for the discussion as well. They can help enact standards, which is extremely important when you talk about things like electric vehicles, because the charging infrastructure has to be standardized so that you don't need 10 cables to bring with you if you want to charge your car in different places. This is, of course, completely ridiculous for customer if you were to expect them to do that. And finally, they can also actually set up the infrastructure. So a lot of clean energy technologies have this chicken and egg problem between the infrastructure and the technology, where car companies, for example, would love to develop more electric cars, but if there's no charging infrastructure, then there's no market for it. But they also don't want to be the ones to develop the whole infrastructure, because they need to do it in such a way that all the other organizations also need to use it. And then they don't want to bear the cost of doing all of that and have all the other organizations free ride on their efforts. So the government can step in to solve this chicken and egg problem for the infrastructure. Good. So this was just a short introduction. Thank you for your attention. If you want to know more about what we do at House of Innovation, you can follow the links provided here.
Thank you, Homer, for that excellent introduction. I thought it was very insightful, and I think it probably raised a lot of questions among the audience. So just as a reminder, if you got any questions based on Homer's presentation, or based on anything that the panelists say, or just something that pops in your head, please send them on to Anna Monson, and she will make sure that we discuss them in the Q&A. So now it's time for us to move to the panel discussion, where we'll be joined by Susanne, Klaas, and Wilhelm. And yeah, I think it's nice to ask you to reflect a bit on Homer's presentation here. And one thing that really stuck with me about the presentation was this kind of this tension between collaboration and competition that Holmer talked about, where sometimes it's a lot more efficient to collaborate, but you still have companies kind of developing the same innovation and having a run for who is there first in the market. And I'd like to ask one of you to reflect a bit on how this is in the Swedish context. May I invite Claes to reflect on this? How do you think this looks? Is there more of a collaboration or a competition environment here in the Swedish context?
I would say it's extremely interesting question because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of competitors that should be better off by collaborating instead. I don't know how many companies have reached out to us where they are providing us with an NDA, and then we should focus for if it's for hydrogen, batteries, whatever it is, and then we realize that they would be much better off collaborating with the next door neighbor that have the same plan, the same goal, more or less. But there are still a lot of, they're fearful about that the next door neighbor might steal their things. But there are also good examples where the opposite happens, where they find each other, where they are building clusters, where they build these collaborations that are truly remarkable, and also something that should be taken after for many other actors in the field.
Thank you, Claes. Yes. Yeah, does one of the other panelists also want to reflect on that? Maybe Wilhelm, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I can build a bit on what Claes said, and I think this this fear of having other companies steal your ideas is not something that is specific to the clean energy companies. Having worked for 10 years as an entrepreneur, I can relate to that feeling that you think that every idea you have is going to be potentially being taken away by someone else. In practice, however, an idea is very little worth without having the execution power to actually drive it and build that idea into a business or into some other type of venture. But that said, my feeling from working in the solar space, which is very much of a early industry still in Sweden, even though it has grown really quickly. And now similar what I'm seeing at Northvolt. I mean, we're building the first gigafactory, the first European true gigafactory producing the world's greenest cells, is that I don't see that I've historically been particularly fearful of competition. And also at Northvolt, I mean, we applaud the other initiatives that are in the same space, because when you are dealing with your little niche of an industry, you tend to exaggerate or kind of underestimate the size of the potential market anyway. So having many companies work on similar ideas, whether in collaboration, ideally or not, there are just so many opportunities, and the market within clean energy. I mean, electricity is the world's most traded commodity. So there's plenty of room for everyone, and I feel that I've sensed that collaborative spirit within the clean energy space, just because everyone is working towards a vision, which is to make the world a better place, and I think that bridges some of that maybe fear that you would see in other industries.
I guess I can comment briefly as well. I must say that I think collaboration is one of the key advantages that we have in Scandinavia. There are people talking about Scandinavia as the Silicon Valley for sustainability, which I think is definitely something that we should have the ambition to be. We have very many interesting companies already, and I think many of them are actually have come out of our ability to collaborate. Northvolt and H2 Green Steel that I'm working with are two examples. Like Northvolt, we started out about 5 years ago, and without industry partnerships, we would not have got off the ground. And that was mainly then from industrial players who were early on to kind of take some kind of risk on our model, because there was a true belief that this was needed. So I must say, and the Scandinavian culture is often about transparency and of course we have the consensus-driven decision making, which has its downsides too. But I think in this we're actually used to working together and having an open attitude. And I think that's really key to some of the big successes that we've had so far. So that's one. And then on the competition bit, I think that's very much needed, because I agree with Willem that in the end, it's an execution game. Several companies can have the same idea, and then the people who execute most efficiently and effectively are the ones who are the winners. So I think you do need to have several people racing towards the in the race to make sure that the best team executing the best, they are the ones that win.
Yes, thank you, Susanna. And if I may immediately jump into a follow-up that I think you touched upon a little bit already, is what can we learn from the Scandinavian context for other contexts, for instance, Germany, or perhaps other European contexts?
I can start off. So was the question what other parts of Europe could learn from Scandinavia?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think that's a very fundamental question that has a much broader application than the particular topic that we're discussing now. I mean, if you look at different surveys, Scandinavian countries tend to have a very high level of trust in general. I mean, to Susanna's point, that there is a lower level of kind of fear also in the corporate sphere that others have a kind of a negative intent. So I think that that's a and that type of development, of course, takes a long time to establish. But maybe on a more practical level, to the extent that you could form these different type of partnerships that Claes was alluding to, and finding mechanisms for companies and organizations to work together. But I think fundamentally it's like we've managed to establish a couple of societies up here in the north that have historically been very very homogeneous, and that is pretty difficult to replicate and in a short period of time.
I think if I was to comment on that, it's obviously increasingly clear that Europe is leading this, the push for sustainability and clean energy overall, I would say. So in that way, it's also for the rest of the world to look to Europe to learn. But then here in Scandinavia, I also think that we do have a mindset where sustainability is close to our heart, and not just it's not just a tick in the box, but it's actually something that we genuinely believe is important. And I think just once you really believe that and understand that, then things start to move. And I think there is where we were early. And then we've also been lucky to have a couple of really strong entrepreneurs and cases that have got off the ground. But I think in this context as well, I think it's more a European game. We're so interconnected now. So it's not Scandinavia separately, obviously. It's Scandinavia together with the rest of Europe. So we're doing it together.
Just to add to that, I think also what shouldn't be underestimated is that our predecessors have been extremely forward-looking, also here in the Scandinavia. We have some, let's face it, north of Sweden, north of Norway, for example, have some of the best advantages, competitive advantages in the world when it comes to green energy, when it comes to a lot of the resources which are now extremely in high demand when it comes to a lot of these clean tech companies. And these, as Willem and Susanna mentioned, also provide extremely good ground for a lot of these new companies. Some of them are extremely large scale. We are talking about, you know, half of Swedish electricity consumption or even more. And some are smaller, but they are building from a good basis. And that's something that we can help each other on forward, because this is, I think it's extremely important. This is short term, but also long term. How should we do this green transition? How should we do the climate crisis? Because we have to do a lot of decisions now, and it's sadly actually yesterday, to have time to fulfill our goals and also to succeed with this. But I'm actually optimistic that we can reach a lot of the goals, because we have a lot of people that are working tirelessly for this.
Yes, thank you. So I think we've covered a lot of like positive things now of the Scandinavian context, but I think it's also important to consider some of the barriers that we still need to overcome. So I just wanna ask you the question of, what do you think the barriers are for clean technology to really like take over and to kind of accelerate, so that we can meet this accelerating rate of climate change?
So I can start off, and I'm gonna give a positive statement here as well, because I think they already are. That's the short answer. I mean, the bulk of new power generation capacity that's being added globally is already from renewable energy sources. So the transition is already happening, and it's happening at a very high pace. But you know, we have an enormous installed base of fossil fuel dependent power generation in the world, you know, as well as when it comes to the transportation sector. But what's being added incrementally is moving in the right direction. The question is, how can that happen even quicker? And here I think there's a real crux of the question is, how do you get rid of a lot of the, let's say, vested interests that are in, especially in the power generation business, where you have access to coal, and there are power plants that are dependent on these fossil fuels that, you know, it costs, there's a lot of investments already made in those assets, and there are a lot of people already working in that industry. So it's about managing this kind of equitable transition as well when it comes to human capital. But I think, you know, the starting point of the question is that transition is already happening. The tipping point is already there, because producing energy from renewable energy sources or having a battery powered car is already cheaper than the marginal cost of producing energy from fossil fuel sources. So it's just you know, there's some inertia in this system that needs to be overcome, but the change is already happening.
I obviously agree with that as well, that the tipping point is where we're at now, and then some areas are leading and some are slightly behind, but the tipping point is definitely here for real. But I think the fundamental thing that has to happen and is happening is that CO2 needs to cost. It has to be expensive to be dirty. So and that's I think where the EU are taking a clear stand. So I think there's not a company out there in Europe who don't believe that CO2 will be a real cost for them going forward. And that's obviously why we're seeing such a rapid change now in all companies, because companies are starting to put that into their numbers and knowing that this will come. And that's also when change starts to happen even more quickly. So on that bit, I'm actually optimistic, but I think we need to see that in more parts of the world. Then I think another barrier or challenge, obviously, for many of these companies is that many of these solutions need a lot of capital, more capital than traditionally has been sent towards startups. We're used to the software startups where you have some kind of software that you develop and then you tweak it and so on. But many of these companies that we need to build actually require a lot of capital early on. They are CapEx intensive, and it will just keep being that way. And that is just something that the financial sector is not entirely used to. And at Northvolt, it was, when we started 5 years ago, it was not super easy to get it off the ground due to that, because it is a very capital intense business, and we needed to find new ways of financing that kind of company. So in that way, I think the more success cases we have where companies have been able to do that and also been proven successful, I think that's really important, because we need a lot of money and we need it now.
But I think just to build on that, Susanna, I think that, I mean, it has, the situation today is so different than it was maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, when you needed public funding to do anything like that. I mean, the nuclear power plants in Sweden would not have been built without public funding, directly or indirectly. So there are a lot of deep pockets and a lot of money that needs to go into long-term assets. So yes, it is challenging to find those enormous sums of money, but I think Northvolt is a living testimony to the fact that it can be done, right? Even with a company that doesn't have a balance sheet to begin with, you can with create a business model based on this type of project financing model. You can actually attract the necessary capital. So it can be done, but it requires a lot of execution power.
I think also if you were going to ask me, Willem and Susanna, like 5 years ago, it was a total other ballgame out there. 5, 6 years ago, just before COVID, actually, a total other market. Because what we see now, as Willem said, that there are a lot of money going into this business. There will be more, of course. And what we see now is, sadly, due to geopolitical things happening in Europe, that the security of supply, there will be a lot of investments going into that in the coming years. Will there be a smooth sailing up to 2030? No. It will be a lot of problems for a lot of companies, but it will also be extreme market opportunities for other companies in this sector. And that's this transition is going to be also kind of an industrial revolution when it comes to this, because a lot of the technology have been there for years, decades, even hundreds of years, wind power and hydrogen, etc. But now we see how they, as Willem said before, are more economical, and they have on par with their fossil neighbors or fossil competitors. And that's going to be more and more so the coming years. But it will create a lot of headaches out there in the energy sector, of course, but a lot of opportunities as well. And we see now how so much money is invested in the sector. And it's a race to actually access these green energy sources, actually.
Well, I think I want to add another thing here when it comes to barriers that we are overcoming. It's the question of talent. So having worked now at a couple of different companies in the clean energy space, it becomes increasingly obvious that this industry is now leading when it comes to attracting the most talented people around the world, and the drive to find a purpose is just instrumental in attracting talent. Northvolt last year had over 100,000 applications for the 1,000 or so roles that were announced at the company, and they come from all across the world, and people from all walks of life and with all types of industry experience. So this is really happening, and this is also going to be pivotal for this industry to be successful in making sure that we're getting the best people.
Yeah, thank you. So I see a lot of barriers, but a lot of hope as well here. And I want to invite Homer to also join in the discussion a bit. And you all just talked a bit about this as well, but funding, of course, plays a very, very crucial role here. And you've already touched a bit upon public versus private funding. So what is the role of public versus private funding in the innovation process for clean energy today? And I want to first ask Homer to briefly reflect on that question.
Yes, thank you, Margot. I was very happy to listen to the ongoing discussion. I think Susanna already touched upon something here, which I think is very important, which is to not make the mistake to treat all the investments into different industries in the same manner, because a lot of people nowadays talk about digitally based startups, which have a very different kind of investment necessity than a lot of clean tech organizations do. Without oversimplifying things too much, I think that a lot of software nowadays can be developed using actually free programs. Python and R can be downloaded for free online, and you can do a tremendous amount of things using that. And the difference is that if you look at a lot of clean tech, and so far we have not really made a very clear distinction between the different sectors, but you can look at wind energy, solar energy, hydrogen, all of those. They are often, what I would call very tangible products. So a startup company, what they would put on the market would be for example, a component for another company to purchase and use in their own products, or it could be actually a whole system that they would use. Now, this requires, of course, a lot of tangible inputs to be produced in the first place. You need to be able to access materials, which is very costly. You need to also access, and this is something that cannot be understated, testing equipment, for example. So if you look at a lot of these startups, and I've had the opportunity to do so through my research, they have very extensive, laboratory equipment available to be able to test their solutions. But to be able to do so, they need to have a physical space to do that, which, in Stockholm is not cheap to come by, for example. And they need to be able to purchase the equipment to begin with. So the funding requirements are very high indeed for these kinds of technologies, which can make it very challenging, but also important to be able to fund these kinds of organizations. Now, the other challenge I think that comes from this kind of funding, and I like the discussion here where people are kind of explaining that it's a slow transition. So probably a lot of people are not aware of the developments happening behind the scenes, because how could they be, right? We cannot open up the factories in Scania, for example, and see the kind of batteries and so on that they're developing, the kind of technologies that they're doing. Also because they, of course, do not want to reveal all the kind of information. But a lot of these things have been happening behind the scenes. And what that tells me is that now we're seeing some payoffs of things that were started, maybe even 10 years ago in terms of the investments. So it's also a very hard sell to give to an investor to say, well, I got this promising technology. There is a high rate of failure because that's inherent when you want to fund research and development. And I might not be able to show you an output for it in the short term. So I think that there's a major challenge there in terms of funding compared to other kinds of industries where the payoff and the output is much more visible, much more quickly. And the kind of funding requirements are also perhaps lower than renewable energy. So I think that these are things that are currently preventing, I think, a lot of new ideas being developed, that these requirements are there and that perhaps there's not a very clear understanding that it's inherent to the kind of technology that you're trying to develop, that you have these complications.
Thank you, Homer. Thanks for that reflection. Now time is running quite fast, of course. So I want to move on to kind of the last theme or the last question before we also invite some questions from the audience. And that is more about the future and the task ahead. So I just want to ask each of you to reflect on what single change would you like to see happen in the ecosystem tomorrow, in the next year, as soon as possible, that would really facilitate this acceleration towards a future with a lot more clean tech? And maybe we can start with Susanna.
Yes, like I said, I actually do think that we're in that tipping point. So many things are happening, and it's actually surprising when you start looking at it, the number of technologies out there that are existing, but all they need is scale. So I think we also just need bold entrepreneurs and the money to actually scale existing technologies and ideas, and that will have huge impact. But then, of course, they will need a lot of money. And like I was saying before, making CO2 emissions expensive, I think, is just one key parameter. And the more expensive it is, the quicker the development, and the more existing companies will tend to pour money into alternative solutions. So I do think that kind of cost is one of the key reasons that we're seeing this positive development in Europe. So.
Thank you. Willem, what is the one single change you would like to see?
Yes, I'm not going to limit myself to one, but that's a right that I'll take myself. So I certainly agree with Susanna that setting a price on carbon, although what we are seeing at the moment is kind of indirectly that thing, because fossil fuel prices are just skyrocketing. So it's almost like adding insult to injury to also set the price on carbon, because that is happening by just the general dynamics of the global supply chains at the moment. Nonetheless, over time, I think that would be certainly an important part of it. So at this point, when it comes to the government side of things, I think building again on what Susanna said, I think in a lot of cases it's about the government getting out of the way and letting these entrepreneurs and the kind of free market act on that playing field that the government can pave the way for, with setting a carbon price, for example. I also want to add to that there are certain things that I believe governments could do that is not accessible for entrepreneurs or for private capital, for that matter, that would have a fundamental role in transitioning the energy system. And that's when it comes to the kind of the power grid, because the transmission system in Sweden is managed by the TSO, Svenska Kraftnät, for example, and the same thing goes for most other markets. And that is actually playing an enormously important role in enabling this transition to decentralized renewable energy assets. We traditionally in Sweden and in most other parts of Europe, the world, have electricity grids that are built for very centralized energy production. And what is now happening with solar panels and with the wind power is that we have millions of injection points across the energy grids that they are simply not built for. So that is also having the government and those players that can to support in developing those parts of infrastructure that are required to facilitate the transition. I think that to me is something that would be very very good for the energy transition, in addition to the more regulatory side of things with pricing carbon.
Thank you. Klaus, what did you think?
I would say that we need more passion in the business. We need more passionate people that loves energy, like I think Willem and Susanna do as well. I've been in this business for the last 10 years. I think it's extremely important. Also, I love it because there are so many challenges to tackle, but we need more. We need more expertise, more entrepreneurs, more people that are willing to help and solve a lot of these big challenges. As Willem pointed out, for example, the power grid, it will be just, I think it's in Germany, I think it's 100 billion euros that is needed in investments. TSO or DSO, there are 800 DSOs, like distribution system operators, just in Germany. Roughly in every European country, there are 200. All of these need help. All of the new companies need help. A lot of the industries that were more consumer oriented are now moving upwards, because they see that their consumers want green products, basically. So they have to secure green assets, green sources. And just last not least, take a look at the Nord Pole price chart, and you see the differences between north or south of Sweden, north of Sweden and the rest of Europe, and you see 40, 50 times difference with the electricity price. I think there are a lot of Stockholm School of Economics alumni that can help in solving that and helping a lot of business. So more people that can join this, fantastic. sector actually.
Yeah, thank you for these excellent questions. Excellent answers, sorry. So now I want to take one of these questions from the chat that came in as one of the first questions. And I think it's very topical. So here's a question. I would like to know what we can expect as an impact on renewable energy from the Ukraine crisis, and especially in Germany. And I don't know if any one of you is particularly keen on reflecting on this question.
I can start a little bit there. So basically, as Willem also pointed out, fossil fuel pricing, more or less the last year, have been increasing rapidly due to both the geopolitical situation and also other difficulties. This shaky and also volatile market will continue. We will see that as well for the oil. We will see that for, sadly, the whole European continent when it comes to security of supply. What that means, basically, a lot more investments will have to go to renewables, green energy. Will that be enough? Sadly not in this time span, because it takes time, it takes lead times. So we will have a shaky market, but there will be a lot more investments, a lot more, for example, storage, hydrogen, inputs to the German and European market, but also the Scandinavian market, to try to replace some of the dependency, what we see. So that's how, but it's gonna be a shaky 2022 and also moving on up to 2025.
I can add something to that, which I think is something that I've been observing. Of course, like many of you have been following the news a lot, and what I've noticed is a lot of, what we call in the academic literature, bricolage, which means, working with the means that you have. So what we might see actually are a lot of innovations that you would never have seen under conditions of high supply, of generous space, of being able to operate. So that might be something that comes out of this, and we've seen it during COVID as well, that when you're pushed into a corner, you might need to innovate using the means that you have, and that might actually lead to very interesting solutions having to do with energy efficiency, especially in the Netherlands. Now people are being advised about how to use heat more efficiently, and these are the kinds of innovations and processes for customers that are very important, because they don't really observe a quick loss in their utility, but there's actually quite a high gain in terms of efficiency, and as a result also, it's also an improvement for the environment as a result. So I think that that's something that we will likely observe to a larger extent.
I guess I am also personally convinced that some of the trends we've been seeing, they will continue and come even stronger and even faster. And I also, on a positive note, because I do realize that obviously the lead times are there, but I also believe in our innovation capability, that new ideas will come up, and in some way, I certainly hope that something positive will come out of all this bad stuff, also in terms of moving even faster on what we need to prevent a climate crisis.
Yeah, and maybe a comment from my side as well, that I fear that this will, it will further accelerate the need for a transition to renewable energies now that all the fossil fuel prices have been climbing over the last few years, and now even more pronounced over the last month, given the situation in the crisis in Ukraine. What it does is, though, that it doesn't only affect those markets that are directly impacted by fossil fuel prices. All type of commodities are now being sent through the roof. So that goes also for many of the commodities required to produce renewable energy kind of related components, including batteries, including solar panels, and so on. So, I mean, the need will certainly be even more pronounced, but it's not it's still going to be challenging just to make all the business cases work that are required to actually invest in these renewable energy assets. What I would, one maybe point that we haven't really touched upon, when we talk about renewable energy, it's always about adding stuff. But I think what a lot of people in Sweden discovered in December and January when electricity prices went high is that, oh, I can actually impact my utility bill by not consuming so much electricity. So there's the whole demand side of thing that I think is a largely untapped potential, at least in Sweden, but also in many other parts of Europe where electricity has been relatively cheap, is that you as a consumer could do a lot to actually not consume so much energy. And I think that could be a positive outcome of very high energy prices over the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, but perhaps not, maybe not that everyone can answer it. So let's see who this question is especially appealing to. So this question is, how can we enable more co-creation of new technologies together with R&D institutions? I think we'll have to keep it to one answer, perhaps.
It's almost a question for you, Holmer.
Yeah, so I suppose research and development institutes, I'm going to give my own definition of what that would be. I mean, how can we enable more co-creation with them? I think that research institutes are positioned in a relatively interesting place from what I've seen, which is they're not really to be put in the same corner as a university, but they can also not be put into the same corner as a for-profit firm. And from what I've seen, they are often able to do something in the middle, where they're also able to attract talents that normally universities would find hard to attract, but that also for-profit firms might find hard to attract. And as a result, being positioned in the middle, they actually have a very unique vantage point in terms of the kind of perspective that they can give. Now, how to enable more collaboration, frankly, from what I've seen, they are, on a European level at least, very involved in a lot of international programs having to do with, for example, if you look at Horizon 2020, the kinds of programs that they're funding in renewable energy, there's almost always one research institute involved. In Germany, there are several. The Fraunhofer Institute, for example, does a lot of research on this. In the Netherlands, we have TU Delft that does a lot. In France, the CEA does a lot of research and is very involved in these kinds of things. So my impression is that they're actually very well positioned, but that maybe they need to push forward their unique vantage point more so that they're not classified in the same group as the for-profit firms and the universities, so that it is meaningful to understand how to collaborate with them and what to get out of it.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so I think that closes our discussions for today. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Klaas. Thank you, Wilhelm. And thank you, Holmer. I just want to say that I really enjoyed these discussions and that I think they were quite hopeful, but that there's still a large role to play for a lot of players, including the government, investors, and even individual consumers. And with that, I want to give the final word to Anna to close the session for today. Thank you.
Thank you all. I can just concur. I found the discussion very, very interesting, and it's nice to see that there's hope for all of us. And I want to thank you all, also all you who listened in, for attending. We hope that you found it as enlightening as I did. And we also want to remind you to please keep an eye out for the post-event survey that we will send out here afterwards, and either tomorrow or in a couple of days. We really, really value your feedback, so we appreciate you taking 30 seconds to respond to our survey. Also, keep a lookout for upcoming invitations to both online and physical events coming up this spring. But thank you all and have a lovely evening. Bye.